insights in current issues in policing. The psychology of it was very insightful. The psychology of the pressure of the job and what it takes to help officers and what could be done to improve a lot of these things. It was very, very insightful. I hope you enjoy it. Please welcome Nancy Panza.
Joe Rogan Podcast, check it out.
The Joe Rogan Experience.
Train by day, Joe Rogan Podcast by night, all day.
Hello, Nancy.
Hi, Joe.
How are you?
I am doing well.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me. Thanks for letting me come and talk.
My pleasure. So tell everybody what you do.
So I am, my day job, I'm a professor in the psychology department at Cal State Fullerton. And in my side gig, I am a forensic and police psychologist.
That is a very appropriate subject for the strange times we find ourselves in right now.
Indeed.
So as you are watching all this play out from the George Floyd murder to where we're at right now, what has this been like for you since this is your field of study?
It's a weird place to be in. You're kind of, for me, caught in between two worlds, it seems. My job is to take care of police officers, so keep them healthy, keep them well, to make sure that they can do a good job doing their jobs. And so the first thing I see is, we got a mess on our hands. For me, when I see a lot of the videos that end up, on TV, my initial reaction is, well, let's have a look. Is there something really to be upset about here? Well, obviously, in seeing the video of George Floyd's murder, there's a whole lot to be upset about here. And so, heartache comes from that. And then my next response is to kick in is, okay, we've got problems on both sides. We need to not only figure out why such things are happening and prevent them, because that's not good. Nobody wants bad policing. Even the police don't want bad policing. On the other hand, how do we also take care of our officers who are out there who now have to go out and continue doing their jobs in a really difficult and overwhelming environment?
Yeah, it's such a strange time because on one hand, you got all these people that are calling out for defunding the police. And, here's a point of view that Ben Shapiro had when he talked about the protests. He said saying they're mostly peaceful protests is like saying O.J. Simpson had a mostly peaceful day when he killed Nicole Simpson, because he was only violent for a couple minutes. The rest of the day, it was mostly peaceful. And he's like, that's a good way to describe the protest. I think you could also say the same thing about the police department. The police department and police officers are mostly good people doing a good job. But the problem is when one, out of all these millions of interactions, when one goes bad or there's a bad officer, people see that, they highlight that, and then they say, this is the cops, these are the cops. I don't think that's true. I've met a lot of great police officers. I know a lot. And it's an insanely difficult job. I don't think they get paid enough. I don't think they get respected enough. I don't think they get trained well enough. I had Jocko Willink on here, who's a former Navy SEAL commander, and his perspective is very clear. He's like, they do not train enough. He goes, if I was in control, they would be trained 20% of their time. 20% of their week would be spent in training, de-escalation drills, safety drills, how to handle things if one of your partners is losing his cool. All sorts of drills that they should be doing that they do in the Navy SEALs that they should be doing in the police department as well.
Yep, I listened to your podcast with Jocko on it, and I was blown. Actually, I listened to it twice. I listened to it the first time. I was like, yes. I loved everything that he had to say.
Well, he's a real leader.
He's so good. And his idea about training was, I'm in full agreement and full. The 20% training thing would be super hard, especially now where we are, because money's going away, not coming in. Because that would mean 20% of the force would be off training, and we'd need that many more officers and that many people on duty, to fill in the active. So, while that would be a dream, and I think he's right, all those skills that you need, if you're not actively, training and keeping them up to par, they're going to go away.
Yeah.
They're going to decay. But on top of what he said, the piece where I was like, yeah, but let me come in and talk with you too, is that, he thinks like the warrior that he is, Navy SEAL, super tough guy, talking about firearms. And he's right. Firearms training is probably not enough. But what's even more so, especially in today's world and society, is that when you look at the makeup of a police academy training, first of all, it's so short. And they get field training after that for a long period of time. And so that's good. It balances it out. But the content of the academy, by far, most of that time in training is spent learning laws, learning the kind of textbook of what it is to be a cop and how to function. And then the other parts, there's the physical training and the firearms training. But if you look at what happens once a police officer gets out there on the job and what they're doing, a huge percentage of it is in communicating. And there is almost none. Almost none. The example I think of that comes to mind most prior to being at Cal State Fullerton, I was a faculty member at John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York. And so in the city, we did some trainings with the NYPD, and we had a contract to do de-escalation training. So when their recruits are coming through the academy, they would come over to John Jay, and we would have police trainers and us, the psychologists, would come in, and we have these wonderful actors who are trained to portray individuals with mental illness. And we did this interactive de-escalation training, teach them how to talk to somebody, what do you say that's going to help bring someone down, as opposed to, and it was this, okay, ready, here goes this training scenario. We pull these rookies up who are scared to death, give them like a block gun, say, okay, go, like wood block, not a real weapon, right. Go to it and engage this individual. And our actors were brilliant and portray these individuals with mental illness wonderfully. And, inevitably they'd come in hot and things, screaming erupts, and the rookie's going for their gun, and we're like, okay, hold up, stop, let's talk about what just happened. From the psychology side, we kind of explained, here's what's going on, here's why that didn't work with this type of individual. The police would come in on the tactics side, and we'd say, okay, rewind, do over, and then we would run them through the scenario, and we would keep stopping and starting. And this interactive, like hands-on training, by the end of the day, they were like, I learned more today than I learned in the last 2 months.
Yeah.
But we got them for one day.
Right.
6 hours. And then that's it. So that whole constant training and giving the skills, not just the firearms and the tactics and the, how to use force properly, but also the communication and dealing with these stressful situations and distressed individuals, because that is what they do nonstop, day in and day out.
Yeah, I know what you're saying when you were talking about how difficult it would be to actually have them train 20% of the time. Right. But I don't think it's difficult enough that we should ignore it. I think if obviously I'm never going to be in control, but if I was in control, I would say that's how it's got to be. Yeah. We have to hire more people. Yeah. I think they need way more people, way better training. And I think there also has to be evaluations in terms of like, how are they dealing with stress? Because it's not just how to de-escalate, how to deal with a situation with a possible criminal, but also how are you dealing with the fact that every time you go to work you might get shot. Right. You might not ever come home to your family. How many times do you see suicides? How many times do you see murders? How many times do you see car accidents? And all that stuff weighs on a person.
Absolutely.
And all those police officers that see that stuff every day, depending entirely upon, and that's one of the things Jocko talked about, their psychological makeup. He talked about it with soldiers, that some soldiers can see some crazy shit and be like, it's okay, I'm good to go. And then other soldiers like, I'm fucked up. I don't know what to do here. I have anxiety. I can't sleep. I'm a nervous wreck.
Same thing is true for cops. Some folks they can go through, have the worst call that you could imagine. Death, gore, loss of a child's life. I mean, these things are horrific. And they see it and, they react and it's awful. But they recover and they're okay the next day. And then, on the opposite hand, you've got somebody who has maybe a less intense or, a less horrific call, and it just puts them over the edge. And, from the psychology side, we've studied this. We've looked at this. How can we tell? Is there a way we can predict, what type of event, what type of person, who is likely to fall apart, to end up with, post-traumatic stress disorder? Can we tell who's likely to develop, a clinical syndrome later? And the shorter answer is we can't. There are some things that we know, and obviously, some of them are really logical. If you're in a higher state of stress, if you've already got vulnerabilities going in, you're, going through a divorce at home and unhappy on the job and drinking too much outside, and you've got all these other things that are already, festering underneath, and then you also are put in front of that. It's not surprising that maybe that would push somebody over the edge into a really troubling place. But other times, it's a really hard thing to predict. And so instead, we need to be there and be on it. And there's so many things that can add in about how we do that in ways that we're really falling short, which is kind of my passion and where I am these days in trying to do a much better job of being on, what we would call officer wellness, because we've historically done a really shitty job.
Is there a standard procedure, like when someone comes back from, say, witnessing a murder? Is there a standard way that they interact with them across all police departments, or is it depending upon the department and what setup the sheriff or the police chief has put in place?
Yeah, very much depending on the department and what they put in place. So when it comes to like the mental health and psychology, the things that we do with departments are, it's very standard these days. Like I think the numbers show about 98% of departments do a pre-employment psychological evaluation before they're hired. That's what I spend the majority of my time doing is screening people who are starting the job. So that part is very normal to do. I can tell you all about that process. Beyond that, what happens from there on out is very much up in the air. Depends on the department. Some departments require what we would call a critical incident debriefing. So some of the agencies that I work with will, if somebody is involved or there's a major incident, every officer who is on scene there will come in and do a debriefing with me or with another psychologist to check in afterwards. And a lot of that is just, where are they? How are they in this moment? Are they okay to go home? Are they safe?
How do you determine
and education.
That? Is it just a judgment call?
It is. It's a judgment call. And the ones that I've done, I would say, most of the time it feels pretty clear cut. Most of the time folks are either they're doing all right, they're a little shaken up, which is normal. I mean, anybody who experiences something life-threatening is going to be off at that point. So a lot of what we do in those debriefings is education. I have these little handouts that I give to all the officers that go through and say, this is what you are likely feeling right now. This is what you're likely to feel in the next couple days. And anything kind of goes. We say in those first few days, whatever you're feeling is probably okay. But then over the course of the first week, we expect people to settle in and to start recovering. And if you're not, then we want to start paying attention to the ways. Are you still not sleeping? Are you having nightmares? Are you having flash? What's going on? And, again, varies by department. Some of them will then also offer up to 4 sessions to come back and continue meeting to see them through that kind of early adjustment phase. And then if they're still struggling at the point at the end, then we can refer them to longer term for treatment. And if everything looks fine, then we say, okay, resume duty or cleared to go back. So that initial meeting afterwards is mandatory, at least for the departments that choose to do it. That's a mandatory. A couple sessions afterwards are not. They're if needed. And then from there, we kind of set the path, like all good, clear, or let's carry on and keep working with you until you can recover.
Do you support this idea that it should be controlled locally by each individual police department, or do you think there should be a nationwide mandate, like some sort of a standard operational procedure where they treat everyone the same way, train everyone the same way, deal with every single murder, suicide, child death, and they have like a protocol that they follow, so it's just standard across the country, based on science?
I do. I think many of these things, these fundamental pieces, should be mandatory. I think pre-employment psychological evaluation is an absolute must. And again, most agencies do that piece. I think the critical incident debriefings are an absolute must and should always occur. And they should be mandatory because that takes away the stigma. No
Right.
cop wants to
Right.
come see the shrink. They see you
Course.
coming and they're like, I'm
Right.
out of here.
Of
Like,
course.
no, keep the shrink away.
But they're probably
Because-
trying to deal with it their own way.
Yeah.
And then somebody that they don't even know who
Right.
comes in and starts probing and asking questions, and they see some guy in a suit,
Yep.
maybe he's never even seen a dead body, And you're like, hey, shut the fuck up, man. I know what I'm doing. Let me just go back out there and go to work.
And the other things that feed into that are, I mean, obviously we know law enforcement, just like military, the culture is very,
Yes.
I am in control.
Right.
I got this.
Right.
I don't need your help. I am tough. I am,
And supported by each other.
Yep. And we
that's
are each other.
Right.
And so that culture doesn't make it inviting to come and talk to a shrink or an outside person. And the other part is that officers are really fearful of losing their jobs.
Right.
Having their livelihood taken away. That's a huge deal. And depending on the psychologist, if they're seeing somebody who is not familiar with law enforcement culture, or who is, real quick to judge and to jump on the, no, we can't have this person out there with a badge and a gun.
Sure.
There's a really delicate line there. You obviously don't want somebody who's unstable to be out there. We want to take care of them and get them healed before. But at the same time, this is someone's livelihood. This is their being. This is who they are. And to take that away haphazardly or carelessly or needlessly is really scary. And
Sure.
so they really do need to have that front. So that's why, like the mandatory debriefing is so important, because if it's, we're going to pick you and you and you, the rest of you guys are fine, then they've been singled out and
Well, it's
the
also,
spotlight.
it's a subjective judgment call.
Right.
So that's where it gets weird. I mean, and I can make a comparison to refereeing in fights. Some referees stop fights where other referees would let the fights go on. And it's really, and it makes people so angry when they stop a fight quickly. If someone comes in and says, this guy's not ready, he can't go back on the force. And the guy's like, what are you talking about? I'm fine.
Right.
And maybe he is fine. And maybe the guy just has a weird sense of people. And so, when you have judgment calls like that, what criteria are they using? Are they using just their own personal opinion? Do they have to fit a set of guidelines? When they say this guy's not fit to go back on the street, he's seen too much, he's too shaken up by this murder scene, how do they make that call?
So it kind of depends on what scenario you're making that decision. So there's two different levels that are most likely. So the debriefing is usually, unless the person is completely shaken.
Okay, let's do a scenario. Let's say guy pulls some guy over. The guy reaches for a gun, shoots at the officer shoots the person, kills him. Big investigation, news, the whole deal. The guy's on television. They show the body cam footage. And then this guy has to do an evaluation and then go back to work again. How would one decide whether or not that guy's okay to go back to work?
Probably going to look at multiple factors. Mental state, basic mental state is our starting point.
And how do you do that?
So questions. In the debriefing, we're unlikely to pull into our bag of tests, which, in the other scenarios, big psych evals, we're going to dig into our tests. That's what we do as psychologists.
When you say tests, not like fMRIs or anything like
no,
that?
No, like MMPI, let me throw out other letters, like
What
the
is that?
personality tests and tests that show different levels of pathology or clinical issues and problems, anxiety, depression, bodily dysfunction,
Do
all
you
those
do a
things.
physical examination, check their heart rate,
I
blood
wouldn't.
pressure?
As a psychologist, I would not. So what I'm looking at is their mental state and just basically their overall functioning. So are they able to go about their daily activities? And if this is right after the scene, I won't know this yet. If it's right after the scene, I will be going and sitting down, talking with them. If they want to talk about what happened and kind of run through the scenario, we have them do that. That can be very telling if they're comfortable sharing that detail. Are they able to describe it? Are they able to get through it without breaking down? Are they able to talk, sort of clearly, even emotionally is expected and fine. In fact, somebody who has zero emotion after that, I would be like, what's happening? What are you
Right.
feeling? But in that, immediate part after, it's really just looking to see what's going on, what's happening. Are they able to function? Are they able to safely go home? Are they having any thoughts about hurting themselves? Are they, are they feeling like they are, kind of losing their mind? Anything that just is completely out in left field. What we often do is, we're going to go on the scene only if the agency wants someone to check in right there. I more often than not see them a day later. Usually it's our rule here is within the first 48 hours. So I'll see them within the first couple days afterwards, and they'll come in. And at that point, they've been able to get through at least one night of sleep. I can see if they're sleeping, if they're eating, if they've spoken to anyone, are they having any major, really strong emotional reactions. And so we're kind of looking to see, what are you feeling? What are you thinking? What's happening? And is it kind of within the realm of what we would expect? And do you need any additional supports right now while you're in this sort of immediate short-term aftermath? The only times that really I'm likely to say you're not ready to go back are the ones that stand out are when, number one, the officer, him or herself, says, I cannot do this right now. I am
How many times have you seen that?
It's rare. It's rare. I mean, maybe 4 times.
In how many years?
Total years, I've been doing this for about 15, but more recently out here in the last few is kind of what I'm thinking of, since I've been doing more than, out of a few hundred. So it's not.
And so what is the protocol? Like, how is that handled? Like, say if there's an officer that can't go back, they say, I just can't handle this right now. Maybe they see a horrific child murder or something like that. Like, what do they do to get back on track, and what assistance does the force offer them?
So the odds are that even without, in that scenario, if they've been involved in a shooting, and especially being the shooter, they're likely to be on an admin leave anyway while everything's being reviewed, because the agency side, the investigations and all the procedures and checks are going on. So they're probably not going back out to the street right away anyway while all of that stuff gets cleared. So that's a good thing. They get a few days to get their wits about them while they're, kind of calming down and recovering from that. So, odds are they're not jumping right back out anyway. But what happens in that time, if we say, okay, somebody's just not ready, we usually say, let's check back in a week or 2 weeks, depending on, I usually will discuss it with them and say, you know what, let's meet again in a week. Take the time, and then I'll check back in with the agency.
So they're just on their own?
We need more time here.
When you say time, just leave them alone, let them figure it out themselves?
Yeah, well, let them go. If they want to come in and continue, if it's an urgent matter, the person's feeling like they might hurt themselves, we're going to continue to see and support and do whatever we need to do to take care of that person.
That is a giant issue, too.
Well,
suicide
absolutely.
Amongst police officers is a huge issue.
Huge. Although it's much more likely to happen from somebody who has not recently been seen. The suicides that happen are the ones that are out there. They're still functioning on the job. We have no idea what's going on because nobody is checking in on that person's mental health.
Okay, so it's not after seeing some horrific incident or being a part of a shooting. It's just the overall stress of the job.
Right. That is one of the biggest problems out there. I feel like we do an okay job having these debriefings right afterwards because we can monitor, we check back in periodically, and we keep touching base until we're feeling, comfortable that the person's good. We also, in those debriefings, get to educate them and say, hey, here are, I give them those flyers and say, look, here's what we know. Here's some good things to do. Here's some bad things to do. Here's what it might feel like. If any of these things are off, here's my information. Call me and come back in.
Is it a real problem with cops just not wanting to help because they're,
the fear.
The fear also, and they're tough guys.
Yes,
a lot of them,
absolutely.
And tough girls. They're like,
tough.
I got it.
I've got this. I mean, the whole job is about being in control. Yeah. Every scene you roll up on, you are in control. That command presence is necessary to be an officer, and so to not be in control, it just feels terrible. And I mean, for anybody, for any human, it's hard to make the call to a therapist and say, I need a little help.
Right.
Anybody who's thought, you know what, I'm not doing so well right now. I really feel like I could use picking up that phone and calling to seek help is a big deal. So for a police officer, right? There's a stigma. Do I really need this? It just is hard to pick up. And
you don't want to be the person that wants help all the time. Like, hey, figure it out yourself.
And can this person really help me? Who's this going to be? How do I find a therapist?
There's a lot of factors.
The most frequent question I get from my friends and family and people. I'm thinking I might need to see someone. Like, how do I go about doing that? Get the question all the time. So for cops, it's even bigger because of that whole control thing. Yeah. And also, like I said before, their job is on the line.
Of course. So for these cops that are in that situation, so when they say, look, I need to take some time off, you basically just leave them alone and say, if you want these resources, here they are? Or did they, I mean, is what?
Again, it's going to vary by
it
department.
Varies. Isn't that kind of crazy that it does vary by department?
Yeah, it drives me nuts.
And has this discussion been had, like, nationwide?
Oh, there's so many good things and pieces of advice and recommendation out there. One of the things that's kind of painful right now is, every morning I get a news recap from the International Association of Chiefs of Police. They send this email out to all the members of there, and they have the psychological services group, and so I get these updates, and I usually just kind of pass them over. But lately, with all the police reform, so it's just headlines from around the country, and the piecemeal randomness of this city's doing this, and this city's doing this, and this city's doing this, and this city, and it's all over the place. That's driving me nuts, because I'm like, there's already been groups that have studied and reported and told us what we need to do to help the world of policing rise up and do better. That information's out there from wonderful, brilliant people who've come together and have laid it out for us. It's there, but yet we don't have that national standard. Each state has certain, most states have a group. Like in California, it's the California Post. It's the Police Officer Standards and Training. So they set all the rules for minimal training requirements for all the departments in California. So all the agencies, police agencies here in this state are, need to comply with all of the post recommendations. But they're all, it's a minimum standard. And our post, California Post, is kind of heads and tails ahead of most of the country. Some states don't actually have that organization. Most do have something similar to like what we have. So they do set some standards, but there's so many things that are not included in that. And so it is a bit, random. It's hard, I think, to make a one-size-fits-all, everybody must do this, because if you think about it, I think there's about 18,000 different police agencies in the U.S., and I think I read about 50% of those have 10 or fewer full-time officers. So, when you've got Podunk, tiny little town in the middle of, the Midwest in a very rural county that's a whole lot different than LAPD.
Right.
So it's hard to have everybody on the same standard and the same expectations when we've got a lot of different makeups for a lot of different departments. That said, there are some fundamentals that I think every department should be held to. And one of those is the debriefings after an incident. And the one that almost no one is doing, that's been talked about for a while, is regular mental wellness checks. At this point, you get a psych eval when you're hired, or before you're hired. And if you're in a critical incident, you may or may not get one. More are starting to do that. And then the only other time you're going to be required to see the psychologist is if you have messed up and you're in trouble and you're referred for a fitness for duty evaluation. And at that point, your job is on the line. Someone is saying that they think you're not fit for duty. And that is a scary evaluation to have to be a part of. Because then you're going in and yeah, if the psychologist judges and decides that you are not able to go back out, well, then you're off duty until you can fix whatever that problem may be.
Right. Well, also, just for the public's health and welfare, it's important to do that.
Sure.
I mean, there clearly are a lot of police officers that are unfit for duty. How do we stop what happened in Minneapolis? How do we stop that from happening, or at least mitigate it?
So, I mean, again, I see everything through my lens as a psychologist, as a police psychologist. So I'm sure there are things beyond my realm that also answer this question. But for me, the things that I think we could be doing different that would really make a difference are the regular annual mental wellness checks. From my perspective, when I look at people like, Derek Chauvin, the officer that murdered George Floyd, and we see what happened there, I would be willing to guess, and I don't know him, I've never met him, I don't know much about his career other than what I've read in the news and whatnot. Police officers that get to that place become that.
Right.
They're not that when they're hired.
Right.
To get hired as a cop, you have to go through what often takes a year-long application process where they are digging and poking into every aspect of your background, your
Let's
life.
be clear, though. That's in some places. In other places, it's pretty easy.
Again, smaller departments that don't
Yeah.
have the resources, probably so.
Yeah.
And then-
I shouldn't say pretty easy in comparison.
In comparison, yeah.
Yeah.
But the vast majority of departments have a pretty, have a similar process in that you're going to go through the application, you have to pass a written test. There's going to be a background investigation, which really I think is a hugely powerful key part. That it should be a well done background investigation. They're talking to people who you know, people from your past, your landlord, your ex-wife, your girlfriend, your boyfriend,
They have
your
the
whoever.
resources to do that for every single candidate?
They do. Now, some agencies take far more care than others.
Right.
The wide variety of people that I see that have passed their backgrounds, some agencies I work for send me the most amazingly clean candidates, and others that are trying to hire a lot less squeaky clean. But they've all gone through, and it is gone through this background. They also do a polygraph. They do social media checks. They make you list all your tattoos, and so they're looking for. And if there is somebody who is just flagrantly racist, has been out there toting white supremacy, like they're gonna see that somewhere in that digging around. So the blatant racist folks are likely weeded out during a good background process. Let's say maybe they're not as openly, because we all know that people know better than to admit to such things most of the time these days, and it could be more subtle. So at that point, what comes next? You've got oral interviews with, police administrators, a polygraph, coming along in there. And once they pass all of that, that's when they come to the last, they get their conditional offer of employment. So they're basically like, as long as you get through these last two steps, you're good to go for the academy. And the last two steps are the medical evaluation and the psych eval. So by the time we get them, they have been heavily vetted, poked around, and looked through in their past, and we get a pretty clean group of people. But then we get to do more digging, and we get to ask questions at this point that they're not able to ask before. So about mental health and background and psychological treatment and history. And so, and then if they get through these evaluations, then they go on to the academy. So for us, that vetting process, that psych eval, is a really important place. And I've had a lot of conversations with other psychologists, in the past few months, like, what are we missing? I taught a workshop a couple months ago for other police psychologists on, some of the things we do in these pre-employments, and had someone say, how do we screen out the cops who kill? And I said, we can't. And that was not a good answer. That we can't. We can't, because we have to, what we're doing here is predicting the future, right? Where we're saying, how do we know who is going to be that person who does that later? Predicting the future is incredibly hard. Figuring out who may be subtly racist or biased is also incredibly hard. So that said, we do a whole lot of things. We've got our psychological tests that we give. We ask a lot of crafty questions, and we dig as deep as we can to try to, again, weed out anyone who we think could potentially become that person down the road, who could be a cop who kills, or who, is racist and biased and is treating people improperly. So, that's one big thing that we want to be very cautious and make sure we're doing a good job of screening up front. But I would say, and there's so much more to say about the tests and the screening, but it gets really nerdy and detailed. I would say that the officers who end up having the most problems are the ones who, once they get on, are in a department where that is the culture. That is that those types of behaviors are acceptable.
So
And
as a
that's
young
bad.
officer, they learned that. Have you ever seen the documentary The 7-5?
I have not.
It's a great documentary about Michael Dowd, who has been a guest on the podcast, he was a terrible cop, and talks openly about how he was corrupted and how his first day on the force he witnessed corruption and was told to shut his mouth.
Yep.
And further went on to become a drug dealer and robbing drug dealers, and just, it's a crazy documentary. You would enjoy it, particularly from a psychological perspective, because he's talking about it after having served time,
Right.
just showing the images from the time and telling the stories. It's the culture of each individual department is different, and some are great. There's a great video of Flint, Michigan, where these police officers, after the George Floyd death, they show up for these protests and tell these people protesting, we're going to march with you. Like, we're a part of this community too. Like, we're your friends. Like, we are police officers, but we are not the person who did that thing, and we wouldn't do that thing. And we want to show you that we support you and that we're here to help. That's what really we want. And it's beautiful.
Yeah.
It's so cool to see them all march together and they're hugging. That's what we want, right?
That is.
But-
and I think that one of the biggest things when we, how do we prevent these issues is we need to look at the individual officer level. But
We need to look at the culture.
I think that is very limited because I think the racist, angry cop who kills has developed that way over time. And I think
Right.
one of the pieces is the culture in the department. Is this something that's acceptable? Is there corruption in that department? And so certainly better oversight and tracking is a really important thing, that should happen. But the other piece, and the one that I focus more on from my end, is the wellness. Is this somebody who is burning out? Is this somebody who has gone into a dangerous place, psychologically, that they started out and they were fine when we screened them up front. But, over 5 or 10 or 15 years, they've seen so much. And, there's things happen in your brain that change the way you think and see and perceive the world when you do this type of work.
Right.
And when you get to a place where those processes have really taken their toll and somebody has gone down this kind of dark path, it's hard to come out of that. And the way they react to the world and the individuals that they see on a daily basis is going to be very different than what they look like when they were hired. So if we're not regularly checking in and seeing who might be at risk for going to that dark place, that bitter and angry place, we're not able to catch them before something happens. And that's where, for me, my big platform is regular wellness checks. I'm not the first one to come up with this idea. It's been suggested by task forces and study groups and people who know a whole lot more than I do for a while now. But in reading, there was a wonderful report to Congress that was put out by the COPS, which is Community-Oriented Policing Services. So they sent this 60-page report to Congress March of 2019 and described in detail, all the things that we should be doing to pay attention to officer wellness. One of which was we seem to think that some regular checkups would probably help, but the problem is no one's doing them, and we have literally zero research on, what are they helpful? Can they prevent this? And I believe they are. So my next big thing is to go and explore and do that research so that we can show, hey, this does help. We can, if we're touching base and we're getting people in, then we can catch the problems as they develop and before they become a major problem where someone's interacting with the community and they go awry and do something awful. Let's take care of them along the way and catch the problems before they become behaviors that are problematic.
There seems to be a lot of discussion now about police brutality, but there's not a lot of discussion about the psychological troubles and the difficult path of being a police officer.
Yeah.
And appreciation for the people that have to do that job. All this defunding the police talk scares the shit out of me.
Yeah.
Because I see what's going on right now in New York City, and it's a goddamn shooting gallery. It's crazy. And the reason why is because the police officers have no trust in the mayor. They want to quit. They don't feel like they get any respect. They feel like they have all been lumped in with this one murderous cop from Minneapolis.
Right.
Now they're all bad cops, and there's a license to call them bad cops. Scream terrible things at them when they've done nothing wrong, when they're just there to protect and serve. A lot of them are good
Right.
people, the vast majority. So when you're seeing this giant uptick in murders in New York City and giant uptick in shootings, and then you still have that dipshit of a mayor calling for the defunding of the police, like, my God, like what? I know so much of the things they say are just political because they just want to appeal to their base.
Yeah.
And there's so many people out there that have this very narrow-minded perspective. They just have blinders on, and their idea, it's like racial justice, social justice, defund the police. It's like this mantra that they have to say with no depth to it. They don't understand the consequences of saying such a thing or implementing such a thing. Now we're seeing a call for police action. because there's a lot of people, a lot of community groups, a lot of people that are community leaders that are in these communities that are just experiencing unprecedented gun violence and crime, and now they're saying we got to do something about this. So they're trying to reinstate some of these policies that they had pulled before. I am hoping that through this, what we had talked about with training and with funding the police more, instead of defunding the police, train them better, fund them more. You obviously need police. This idea that you don't need police, are criminals just going to go away? Like, is crime going to go away? You know, we have a problem.
Yeah.
We have an enormous number of people, and out of that enormous number of people, there is a certain percentage of them that will victimize other people. They will steal, they will kill, and if they don't get caught, then you develop a culture of crime. And then you develop a thing where you basically have what's going on in Mexico, where the cartels have more power than the police, which is a terrible situation. If you have that in individual locations like in New York City, if all of a sudden these criminal gangs develop more gun power, more support of the community, they have more people than police officers, you've got a giant problem. And the actual peaceful citizens are the ones that are going to be in trouble. And all those people that are out there protesting that think they're immune from it because they're the ones saying defund the police, hey man, they'll fucking rob you too. They'll shoot you too. Like, you don't understand humans and you don't understand violence. And so this utopian world that they're trying to push, like defund the police, we're gonna refund, we're gonna put that money into the community and everything's gonna be fine. It's not gonna be fine. You need to fund the police more. You need to train the police better. We need more oversight. And we need to recognize that this is a time where everybody's got to come together on this. And we got to figure out what's wrong, fix what's wrong, recognize that there's some problems. But you can't blame all cops. And you can't say defund the police, because that's nonsense. That is a silly, like a version of life that it's not real. Yeah. You need good cops, better cops. Are you saying we need to get rid of bad cops? Yes, definitely. I think everybody agrees with that. How do you do that? That's where the question starts. And training them more. Like this idea that you can't spend 20% of the time training them. Well, if you did spend 20% of the time training them and there was a lot less crime because of it, and the interactions with people were much better, wouldn't that just be overall better? Is that an impossible task? I mean, how much money goes into the police department? You telling me you can't add 20% to that and train them more? I bet you can. And I bet you could find it financially beneficial. I would see overall, if you could reduce crime that way and reduce the animosity between citizens and the police, wouldn't that be better for everybody?
It would. And I agree with you. I mean, on the defunding thing, you know, I think, and you've had other people say this too, and you know this, I'm not saying anything amazing here, that like it means different things to different people. Right. And I wholeheartedly agree. The folks who think defunding means like just get rid of them, like that's silly. What's your plan B? What do you do?
I don't think they really mean that.
I don't understand what happens next, and I haven't heard anybody articulate, so then what? And again,
there is no then what. That's why no one has a then what.
Those the emails I get that talk the headlines. I saw one yesterday or the day before that in Minneapolis now there are groups of citizens banding together, armed citizens banding together to patrol the streets for crime, and I thought, oh my God.
Exactly.
Oh boy, that's a shit show waiting to happen. Because then you're going to have community members shooting people, and then they're charged with
they're charged with murder.
It's a horrific thought, and I can't quite imagine like that. So I completely understand the anger and the frustration, because you're right. We don't need bad cops. There's nothing worse than the person you call to protect you and to help you when you're in an emergency doing the wrong thing and doing harm.
Right.
That we don't need or want that. And I wholeheartedly agree that more training and the right type of training and spending that time, because I also think that the training gives you access to see where people are and if they're on a good path or if they are that problematic person.
Oh, you see what kind of character they have things, too if you test them during this training.
So if we're seeing them on a regular basis and pulling them out and giving them the tools that they need, then absolutely I think that is an exceptional thing to do. That was part of what your podcast with Jocko just blew me away with the way he talked about. And the other thing that sort of has gotten lost is this whole idea of the interaction with the community, with community-oriented policing. And it's exactly what Jocko was talking about when he was talking about being overseas, and I think he was talking about Petraeus and the order of, you don't just roll up in your tank and cruise through. You stop and you talk and you humanize yourself and you engage with these, with the folks here, and you let them know that you're here to protect and to serve, and you connect with them, and that helps both the community citizens and the soldiers. That's the same thing that we're wanting here at home in this country, that your police are supposed to be your supporters and your resources and the people that you trust and are connected to. And that is what community-oriented policing is. It's not a new idea.
Right.
It's been around for decades. But we somehow still don't have that going on now. It's still, what seems like everything in society is now, it's us versus them. It's the police versus the community, instead of we are a community together and we need to work with each other to keep this place safe and to understand what the biggest problems are, what are the citizens' concerns. And it isn't easy to do. It's not an easy thing to do, but it works.
Yeah. I go to a tactical range where they teach you how to shoot handguns, and the guy who teaches me was telling me you would be stunned at how inept some of these cops are that come here. He goes, they literally barely know how to shoot a gun. And I wouldn't believe him, except I've seen so many cops that are so fat and so sloppy. And I'm like, how are you going to defend yourself? Like, the idea of you serving and protecting, like, dude, if someone throws you on the ground, you're not even getting up. Like, how does that happen? How do they now have standards for, like, being able to shoot a gun, knowing how to handle it properly, being accurate, being consistent with your training, and also physical fitness? Like, that's the job of a police officer, is dealing occasionally with violent criminals. When you have no capacity to defend yourself, how are you able to help people? You're only like, if you're in a situation where something turns physical, if you have no ability to defend yourself physically other than firearms, a situation that could be de-escalated turns into a violent encounter because you have to shoot someone.
So a couple of things that come to mind. So, imagine that. Police officers do get annual firearms training. They do have to pass, in most places, an annual physical fitness test. And you're saying, already you're seeing people who are out of shape and overweight and physically not in great condition, and you're seeing people who can't shoot well. But yet those are regular. There are regular firearms trainings, annual firearms trainings, and there are regular physical fitness tests.
Everywhere, though?
Most states have a minimum in initial training, and there's so much variety that I'm sure not everywhere, but most departments have annual, service that you in-service training you've got to go through and do. And so if we're still seeing that, people who are out of shape, yet they've passed a physical fitness test, and who can't shoot, but imagine their mental health. Imagine what that looks like.
Right.
And there is no annual mental health training, mental health check-in. And I promise you that the job erodes that over time. So just if the things we can actually see, that the shooting isn't on par and the physical health isn't on par, the one we can't see, what's going on the inside, imagine how messy that might be.
Yeah.
And there's nothing. We have no oversight and no regular check-ins there. So that's one thing that sort of stands out. I was like, but imagine that.
Yeah.
The other thing is firearms training. Obviously, it is super important if you're going to carry a weapon to be able to use it and to use it well. But it's also not something that you're going to encounter on a regular basis on the job. There are officers who go through their entire career without ever pulling a weapon.
Well, that's great.
Right? That is great. And when you do, it should be few and far between, because there are other ways to manage situations. There are, that's lethal force, and then we've got a variety of non-lethal force, whether it's something physical, hand-to-hand kind of thing, or whether it's a taser or baton or whatever else they may be using or having on their tool belt. So there are other options there. So hopefully, that the continuum is set from verbal de-escalation, communication. When that doesn't work and it's still a danger, then there are certain criteria, and obviously officers are taught their continuum of force and what needs to be necessary to move up that level, with deadly force, or lethal force being the highest. So it's so rare that to me there's so much else that comes before that if we're doing a good job, that almost is never an issue because these other tools work better.
Wait a minute. What's almost never an issue? Being able to use a weapon?
Having to shoot someone. Having to get to where you're breaking a strap and you're pulling your weapon and you're firing at someone. That should, that is the last. It doesn't happen on a daily basis.
But isn't that entirely dependent upon where you're at and what kind of situation? I mean, all across the country, there are situations where cops have to pull their guns and have to use them.
There are, but they're not as frequent as
But they're
you think.
happening every day.
Probably somewhere every day, but
Yes,
not every
but-
day in every officer's life.
Right. But if it's
Right.
you,
If it's you,
if
you
you're
need
that
to know.
officer, you got to be ready.
Yes.
Like this idea
Yes.
that's not important. It should be of critical importance.
Not that it's not important, but that there are so many other things that need to also be in place.
Yes.
Because if these other skills are in place,
Right.
if you are a master, they like to call verbal judo, if you can talk someone down, if you are a master at de-escalation, you are never going to need these other tools. Maybe not never. But you
Yeah.
are very rarely going to need any, the less lethal force or the least lethal force.
Yes.
Because you are
Okay.
managing situations. If you suck at these, you need these a lot.
I see what you're saying.
Right? So for me, because I, deal with communication and deal with, de-escalation and how to talk someone down, how to talk to an individual with a mental illness, how to talk to somebody who's a victim or who's been traumatized, how to talk to somebody who's maybe on drugs and not able to, how do we manage those situations with verbal, with interactions, with communication, so that we don't have to go up the chain of command of, of levels of force.
But that seems to me to be an incredible amount of training that must be necessary. And it also has to be constant and consistent.
Absolutely. And that's why when you and Jocko were talking about the training and how much
Yeah.
more, I'm like, yes, let me get in on that. Yes.
How much training do they have to do in terms of hand-to-hand combat?
I don't know. I'm not sure how much. And again, I'm sure it depends on what academy they go through. Some academies are 4 months, some are 6, some last longer, and the makeup depends on who's running that academy as to like the breakdown of, how much is in the classroom, how much is physical, how much is tactical. So I'm not sure what the numbers would be on that.
Andrew Yang, presidential candidate, former presidential candidate, he had an awesome idea. He said every person who is in the police force should be a purple belt in jiu-jitsu or higher. And I think that is a really good idea because at that level, you have a real understanding of how to defend yourself and how to control bodies. Mm-hmm. I saw a video, I've seen quite a few of them, but one of the more pathetic videos I've ever seen was 2 people trying to hold one guy down completely ineptly. The guy gets up, runs, gets into his car, and shoots both of them, and then takes off. And I'm like, Jesus Christ. Went into his car, got a gun. Like, they had no control over this guy, 2 people. And I'm like, that should never take place.
Yeah.
And this guy wasn't some freak of nature either. It wasn't like they're trying to hold down Herschel Walker or some super athlete. No, it's just like a regular guy. Just they sucked. And it's terrible to watch.
Well, so, part of the challenge with officers also is that we think of it as this, go, 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 do, adrenaline junkie job, which there are spurts of that. But, a lot of that 12-hour shift is sitting and waiting or patrolling, depending on what you're, where you are and where you're patrolling. It's tedious, and then it's intense or difficult or stressful, and so it's
so they need to be trained to recognize that that's what's going to happen too.
Yeah,
and to be psychologically prepared that this is part of what it is.
Yeah, I remember the first time I went on a ride along with someone and thinking, this feels so much different than what I thought it would feel like. First of all, everybody stares at you and is looking at you, and you're like just standing out no matter where you go because you're in the patrol car, cop car.
Where did you go?
Oh, I've been many times, and my first one was decades ago in North Carolina. I had a police officer for a roommate who took me out the very first time, and on my first ride along, it was at nighttime, just tedious, boring, a couple of low-level arrests, but just the the way people respond and react really just felt so much different than I thought. And then I went out again a while later and saw a dead body and had all sorts of weird experiences on that one. Just the difference from shift to shift to the adrenaline excitement or something scary or overwhelming happens, and then the, just tedious and monotonous shift. And there's so much unpredictability and uncontrollability that you do sort of need to be alert and on and ready. And part of that is what does a number on an officer's mental health.
I would imagine also the current state of the way people are treating police officers has got to be devastating.
So much.
It changed in just a few short months. We went from just most people have respect for the police to it seems like it's in fashion to talk shit about cops.
And it comes and goes, right? You see,
but this is about as bad as it's ever gotten, don't you think?
It's bad now. And when I talk to folks and
it's nationwide too, which is what's fucked up.
Yeah, it's not isolated. It's not just an LA thing or a Minneapolis. It has really spread.
Who would have ever thought that one incident would ignite this powder keg the way it did? Because every other incident that we've had in the past, like the Rodney King incident, that just started riots in Los Angeles. It didn't do anything in New York, but this one is across the world. Yeah. I mean, there's riots in London. Yep. You know, I mean, people are going crazy in France because of this.
Yeah. And who knows? I have no idea what it was about this, other than it was just so outrageously awful.
Yeah. There's that.
It's so outrageously awful what happened, and to watch that, it was the video. We all got a first-hand look at something hideous.
There's
and scary. So I think the video, you literally saw a man lose his life, and that was traumatizing for anybody who saw it. I'm sure the pandemic and everyone being shut down and restless and all the, effects of that mentally and psychologically on all of us, just sort of the unrest of that combined with the horror of what happened.
There's also the guy who got shot in Georgia.
Right. Ahmaud Arbery with what had happened to him.
Just before that, and then this was like the last straw.
It was just enough. And I agree. I found it, especially in those early weeks, very stressful to be somebody who really loves and supports law enforcement. My whole goal in life is to take care of and protect cops and to help them be good and do a good job. That's my passion. That's what I want to do. But I'm also very opposed to racism. I want to be as anti-racist as I can be too, and to stand on both sides and to say, can I be both of these things, and to work through and say, well, yeah, I really can, because that's not what we want cops to be doing out there.
Yeah, I think
we've got to find a way to not do the us versus them, and to meet both. Good cops, anti-racism, those are things that can go together.
Yeah, I think everyone can agree that racism is awful, and racism by police is awful.
Yeah.
It's psychopaths that scare me. Yep. It's not just racist. It's like that guy that shot that man in the hotel in Phoenix. Do you know that story? It made the guy crawl, and the guy's pants were falling off, and he kept reaching back. He said, "Don't reach back," and then he shot him.
There was a cop that did that. I don't remember the story. Yeah.
Well, the guy had a toy gun, and someone reported him. They were drinking. They were in a hotel room. SWAT team shows up. They tell this guy tells this guy to get on the ground. The guy gets on the ground. He's crying. He's saying, "Please, I didn't do anything." And then he says, "Crawl towards." He gives him these really fucked up instructions, like, "Crawl towards me." The guy's crawling, and his pants are falling down. So he goes to reach back and tries to pick up his pants. The guy's screaming at him, "I will fucking shoot you." And it's really clear there's nothing in his pants. He's just reaching back because his pants are falling down. And so he says again, "Crawl towards me." And the guy's pants are falling down. He reaches back, and the cop just lights him up. While he's on it, face down, no threat, no weapon, no nothing. It's one of the grossest ones you've ever seen, and it's a white guy doing it to another white guy. I think racism is awful, but psychopaths are what the problem is. Right. It's not just racism, it's psychopaths that are racist. Or, I think that guy had problems that Derek Chauvin, didn't he have problems with white people too? He had a long history of abuse. There was, I think,
certainly wouldn't surprise me.
There was multiple incidents. And this is what's scary to me. It's like, how does a guy stay on the police force when there's multiple incidents of him abusing people? Like, at what point, like, did they just said, well, we never thought he was going to kill somebody. We just thought he was rough, but he was a good cop otherwise. Like, is that how they're looking at it? Like, how does a guy like that get to a place where, you know, when you go back and look at his complaints, and this guy was one of the reasons why Amy Klobuchar was kind of tanked as being a vice presidential possibility, because she was in control back when this guy was doing this, and they said, like, well, they'll connect it to her.
Right. I remember reading that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know that. Obviously, I don't work in Minneapolis. I don't know what was going on in their department, but just from the things I've read and heard, you know, media, which I always take with a grain of salt because you never know what you're getting, is that he'd had multiple prior incidents, multiple prior shootings.
I don't know how to go
One
faster
was
than
fatal.
that. Yeah, I was going.
These are,
I think I was going as fast as I could.
Markers. Now,
if I went faster than that, I'd probably just spin
you know,
out.
Take this prior to this incident.
So I have no idea how this guy got 1 minute 34.
And if I just saw that he'd had
1 minute 33 in the qualifying,
and prior shootings,
probably just set up at the car. Right?
That may or may not be enough for me to say, hey, what's going on? And that depends on what were the complaints. You know, citizen complaints happen all the time. Right. So just seeing that someone's had a complaint, you know, you could give someone a parking ticket and they think you're an asshole. And so they call up and complain, they treated me unfairly. When you look back at, you know, if there's body cam footage or whatever, and it's a perfectly normal stop, but that person's just pissed off because they got a ticket. You know what I mean? So a complaint can be something very substantial and very real and problematic, or it could be one of these that citizens complaints come all the time. How
do you feel about the other cops that were on the scene that were there with him?
I can't understand how one wouldn't intervene and say, okay, that's enough. Let's back off now.
Was he the senior officer?
I don't know. It sounded like, because I know they said two of the guys were pretty new on the job. And the other one, the one that you can see kind of standing in front, had also been on the force for a while, but I don't know which of the two had been on longer.
The way the culture is, excuse me, the way the culture is, the two that were new, if they saw him do that, it's not really, is that a thing that they can say? If you're a new guy and you've been on the job for a couple months, and there's a guy who's been on the job for 20 years, and you see him doing something, is it your place? I understand it's your place as a human being.
Right.
But how does the culture work? It
is a paramilitary environment where if someone is your superior, it is very hard to speak out against that person. So that is definitely a problem, and something that, you know, to act out. And the culture in the department would be, if that's somebody who either is a higher rank than you or who's been on longer, you know, especially if they're brand new and that's like their field training officer, you're not going to step in and tell them not to do that.
It kind of has to be.
It's not the way it's done. Yeah, that's that paramilitary model.
So if you are shit out of luck and your superior officer is a psychopath, and he's doing something like that, if he doesn't kill that person and there's no complaint, what recourse does that person have? If they go to
the person who is the victim or the other officer?
The other officer that's there. Like, what recourse does that officer have? If you're seeing someone abuse someone and you're new on the job, can you go to internal affairs? Like, and if you do, there's a stigma attached to that, correct?
So there are ways to report fellow officers, yes. But would most people do that? It's a tough call. Yes, it happens, and some people do the right thing. But there's a cost that comes with that. I think
one of the silence.
One of the interesting reforms that lots of folks are talking about in some cities or passing is this requirement for other officers to say something. And this is an interesting one. There's a lot of these piecemeal reforms that kind of make me go, like, okay, it's fine, but I don't know if that's going to make much change. This one makes me stop and think, and I wonder if maybe it will. Maybe it will. I don't know. I see it could go both ways, where it could be something that's helpful if there's a safe mechanism for people to report. But, you know, in that situation, you know, thinking about the George Floyd situation, you know, if two of those officers had said, hey, you need to back off, and again, still if they're inferior to him, you know,
what happens are the odds, in the culture?
Yeah, what are the odds that he's not going to tell them, screw you, like, I'm superior to you, you back off.
And then so tell everybody else also of the force, and then it becomes...
And then they're the snitch, and they're the, you know, the weasel and whatever else. And so it's really, the idea, I think, is a great one. let's put this law in place that you have to report it or to intervene if you see something. But I just wonder how that'll look as it plays out. And you can't have a divide among people that you have to work that closely together and you have to rely on to protect you, to have your back.
And body cameras really are only good once something's happened and you have to review the body camera.
Right.
It's not like someone's reviewing the body camera every day and going, Mike, you're kind of a cunt. Like, the way you treated those people, you fucking asshole. Like, why are you so rude? Why are you so mean? Like, this is not good as a police officer.
Yeah. The only thought that folks had, especially when body cams were first becoming the thing and tons of departments were starting to use them, was people thought that kind of, big brother's watching feeling. Yeah. Well, if we know we're on camera, we're going to be on our best behavior, and that we're going to always do the right thing. And I'm sure there is there's
one
some
way to
element
do that.
of that, but
there's one way to do that.
What's that?
You stream it live, all cameras. You have
that's a lot of footage.
Yeah, right.
That's part of the problem in police departments when they start to implement body cam footage. They have to make these big decisions on where do we store this data, how long do we keep it, what all these
YouTube.
Massive decisions. So we flood YouTube.
Listen, people are flooding YouTube anyway.
True.
I mean, it sounds crazy, but if you did do that, there would be very little shenanigans. I mean,
Well, we kind of have that already because cell phones.
No, you don't.
I mean,
no. If
maybe
no
not
one
every
has a
minute.
cell phone and it's just one perpetrator and 3 cops, you don't have anything.
Yeah.
If everyone was streaming all the time, it would be really hard to get away with a lot of the stuff that people get away with.
It would be, and one of the things I've heard people talk about with body cam footage is having, sort of that oversight committee to regularly review footage. In fact,
you'd be reviewing 8 hours a day, all day
of
long.
all the officers on there. It's such a monumental type.
Leave it
of
to
thing
the people.
To get around.
Put it on YouTube.
Sounds scary.
What's not scary about it?
Just the chaos and mayhem that would ensue from that.
Well,
but
also accountability.
True.
Both things would ensue from that.
True.
Let's talk. Here's another example that made me sick. It has nothing to do with racism. When they were in, was it upstate New York, where they pushed that old man down and he fell and bounced his head off the ground and was unconscious, and I think he's still in trouble.
Is he?
Yeah, he's still hurt. I mean, look, he was really old.
Yeah.
And he fell and slammed his head off the ground. So they charged the officer for doing that, and then the rest of the officers, they quit. Clearly, you shouldn't push an old man like that. Clearly. When that guy falls and hits his head, you got to look after him and give him medical attention. The guy was unconscious, bleeding from the back of his head, and he's really old.
Yeah.
Like, if you're that old and you fall down like that, he easily could have died.
Yeah.
And you've got these cops that just walked away while this guy's down like that. Well, what did the guy say that was so bad that they had to push him down? I mean, he's some sort of like radical left-wing activist and has been that way his whole life, but he didn't touch anybody. He didn't assault anyone. Like, why did they do that to him? And why did those other cops, why did they retire? Well, they quit because of this same camaraderie. And I understand that. You need that. If you go to war together, you have to stay together. You have to stick up for each other. You're a part of a team. I understand that, but you can't do that. And the whole world saw that.
Yeah. What else can I say? You can't do that. You can't do that. I can't. I wasn't there. I haven't talked to those officers. I don't know what happened before. I don't know what happened after. All I see is, again, these little snippets that come onto the news media, and
you just see a guy push a frail old man.
What you see is something that's awful.
Yeah.
But when you've got these police and they're lined up and they're marching, like what's going on, and how could that have happened and why? Like I don't know. I don't have an explanation for that one. I would like to know. I would like to talk to the people. I'd like to see what was happening, why it was in that,
those
that
all
kind
pile
of mindset.
Up.
Yeah.
They pile up. All these videos pile up. All these times where cops abuse people pile up.
Yeah.
It's so unfortunate. And every time a cop fucks up, every other cop has to deal with the pain of that.
Yeah.
They have to deal with the stigma, and they have to deal with the anger and the backlash.
It's definitely the one of the hardest aspects of the job is that you're given an immense amount of power,
Yeah.
That badge and that gun just are tremendous in terms of what they give you liberty to do. And like all humans, power can corrupt. Nothing corrupts more than money and power, right? Well, cops don't have money, but they've got the power. Yeah. And they, it is so easy to let that, to go the wrong way. And so, and like I said, I don't think that that the folks that you see in these videos started out as bad people.
Right.
I don't think I spend so many days of my life evaluating these folks who want to go into this very noble profession. And the majority of them are just really great people. Occasionally you get an idiot that comes through, and usually they fail because they don't belong on the force. And that person, no thank you.
My fear is that more idiots are going to get in now because less people want to be police.
Well,
so it's going to be even worse.
It's doubly scary now. The defunding thing obviously is a huge issue. Like, what's going to happen? Agencies are not going to be able to hire because the money's being taken away.
It's a political thing as well. It's like
totally
when
political.
They say we're going to defund the police, all the progressive people go, yes.
Yeah.
I want to be unsafe. Yes.
But the combination of the defunding as well as the tanking economy, some of the departments that I work for, the money that comes into that city or that town to support the department, that we're all at the financial crisis that's going on from the pandemic. So I've a few of the agencies that I work for are like, we don't anticipate hiring in maybe the next 2 to 3 years. So, and that's partly, and some, it's not a defunding thing issue. It's the financial crisis from the pandemic.
Right.
That there's things that are...
There's cuts across the board.
Yeah.
And they can also use that as a political ploy. Like, say we're defunding the police as well, but really they're cutting education, they're cutting all sorts of services.
So we're all suffering right now because of the financial crisis that's going on from this COVID crap. But in addition, then you've got that, plus the COVID stuff. And, you've got departments who are going to be really strapped for being able to hire. And then, like you said, who wants to go into this job now? In fact, when I do these, I'm still doing some evaluations right now. And the question that I start off is, why do you want to do this?
Right.
Given the current climate, what makes you want to be an officer? Just to hear what their thoughts are, and to sort of get into their mind a little bit on what is it that makes you want to do this? Because really, you got to be second guessing your options here at this point, because it's not an easy time to be a cop.
What if I gave you a magic wand, and or the president did, and the president said, "Look, Nancy, we got a real problem. We want you to help.
Yeah,
and we'll let you structure the program for the entire country for the police officers. Yeah. What do you think should be done? Cost no option."
I love that you asked that question. In therapy world, therapists, we ask that question for our clients all the time. We call it the miracle question.
Oh.
Therapist trick you just did right there. And you do it to a lot of your guests. I like it.
I don't even know.
Total therapist trick that we do.
I didn't know.
Yeah. In your life, if things could be perfect, what would it look like? So look at you.
Okay.
So if I could
I'm a therapist.
You are. You didn't even know. If I could just take over and make all the changes. Honestly, I would take the advice of the amazing people who have done a ton of work already. About 5 years ago, there was a task force put together to, recommendations for what should 21st century policing look like. And they lay out in a, 170-page document what policing should look like. And this really amazingly brilliant group of people came up with some excellent advice. And it talks about racism, and it talks about technology, and it talks about community-oriented policing, and it talks about wellness and all the things that I see that are missing. It's been sitting there for 5 years. And not to say that nothing has happened since then, but we certainly haven't enacted what that task force put together. And what they recommended back then. Take that and all the other great work, change and reform. Right now you see it happening left and right all over the place, right? It's piecemeal, it's haphazard, it's political, it's let's satisfy the unhappy folks right now. And I agree that people are demanding change and they need action, they want to see it right now. I get that. It's satisfying to say, yes, there's change.